So, yeah, welcome to this book launch of Red Book Middleweight, which I have a copy here to wave at you. So first of all, yes, I'd like to invite Val, who's from the publisher Equinox, to say a few words, and then after that I will give a talk about the book and you'll be open to ask questions or discuss the issues. Okay, so Val.
Well, hello everyone. Thanks for joining the book launch. This is Robert's third book now that we've published, and we're delighted to be bringing these books out. It is available. I think there was a link on the invitation for the launch, which leads you to the book page on our website. That's right? And we are offering 25% off the book if you order it from our site. And you need to use the code EQX, which is all in capital letters. It's $24.95, I believe, for the paperback, and beautiful color illustrations. So I hope you're inspired by what Robert's going to say, and that you'll have a look, and you can see a descriptive material about the book, the full table of contents. So have a look after the talk if you haven't already checked it out.
Okay, great. Thank you, Val. Okay, so basically I'm going to talk about, well, first of all, about the middle way generally. So the approach that I've developed over the last 20 years or so, which is generally called middleweight philosophy. So it's a practical philosophical approach, you could say. So it's in some ways inspired by the Buddha, but also inspired by lots of other sources. And, a practical approach, which also obviously links in with Jung. So I'm going to say a bit about that in general, and then I'll say a bit about Jung's Red Book specifically. So I'm expecting some of you will be more familiar with the middle-way approach and others with Jung. So there'll be a bridging process there. And then I'll talk more about the arguments in the book and the approach taken by the book. Okay. Just a reminder that if you could keep yourself muted, then prevents any background noises, but also it prevents you coming up on the video in the middle of the talk. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint which has various pictures and things on it. So I hope you can all see the PowerPoint. So first of all, you've got the cover of the book there, Red Book Middle Way. How Jung parallels the Buddha's method for human integration. I mean, I talk about a parallel because for me, the middle way is not just a Buddhist thing. So it's a universal principle, if you like, a principle of judgment. But it's obviously well exemplified and gets its name primarily from the Buddha's instance of it. But this is also paralleled in Jung. So there are mentions of the Buddha and comparisons with the Buddha at various points throughout the book, but the main focus is on Jung and the interpretation of his Red Book. So a little bit then about the middle way. So this is the symbol which we've adopted in the Middleweight Society for the middle way. It's basically, you could see it as a path for working with our judgments, for improving our judgments in relation to the conditions around us. So we encounter all sorts of different conditions in our lives as we go on through our lives, which keep changing. we need to be able to engage with those conditions as effectively as possible. By doing that, or in order to do that, we need to make the most of our experience as much as we can. We need to learn from our experience, because our experience keeps changing, and whenever our perspective gets stuck, if you like, then we are unable to learn from experience. So the middle way is about avoiding getting stuck, you could say. So it's avoiding two kinds of ways of getting stuck on either side of our judgment. So we can have positive absolute claims and negative absolute claims. So a lot of the middle way involves recognizing absolute claims and why they're a problem and what they look like, because they're much more common than people tend to assume, for one thing. They crop up all the time in our experience, in our judgment, and using that to help us focus in on what is most practically informative and helpful for us, that is experience. So the focus is on judgment, and perhaps the thing to emphasize at this point is that it's about judgment, not about beliefs about the universe. Very often the middle way is or has been presented in terms of beliefs about the universe, which can be a big distraction from the actual practical process of encountering whatever we're encountering and making judgments about it, and obviously being aware of the emotional states and so on that we're in relation to the judgments we're making. Okay, so obviously this has a strong relationship to the Buddha in the way in which it developed and the way in which people often think about it. So the Buddha exemplifies the middle way in all sorts of different ways, but perhaps the strongest symbolization of the middle way can be found in the Buddha's early life. So there's a couple of pictures here which just illustrate some key points in the stories about that early life. So I take those stories to be symbolic. It doesn't matter whether or not they are historical or whether they contain a historical element. So the first picture on the left you'll see there is a traditional depiction of the Buddha leaving behind the palace where he's supposed to have been brought up as a prince. So leaving behind his wife and child and servants and all the luxury of the palace. So the story goes that he had this very confined existence early in his life, where there was said to be a very strong emphasis on the completeness of the view of the world that he was fed with, if you like, as a child and as a young man. So he's brought up to be a king with a particular idea of the duties of being a king and the palace, the ethos of the palace in which he was brought up. So he became dissatisfied with all that and he left it. So that's the one decisive point. And then there's another decisive point a little further on in his life. So he then goes forth into the forest in search of enlightenment, as he sees it at that point. He has to learn to live without all these luxuries and all these relationships that he was brought up with. And then he learns from two different teachers, but he doesn't find as complete a view as he's looking for from these two different teachers. So he learns meditation, he learns wisdom and so on from these teachers, but he carries on searching, and then he falls in with 5 ascetics whose austerities are pictured in the picture there. So like lying on beds of nails or burning yourself, or being in uncomfortable positions for long periods of time, or starving yourself as a no one. Being an ascetic requires a very rigid view of the world, because you have to believe, metaphysically really beyond your experience, you have to believe that your ascetic practices will be rewarded in the future because of the system of karma or whatever in the cosmos. So you have to believe that either you'll get a better rebirth or you'll be enlightened or whatever it is. So the Buddha recognized the limitations of that perspective. So he's pictured walking away there from the ascetics. So that's the other decisive move. So we get the two extremes, and then we get the middle way. So he recognizes the limitations of two all-encompassing absolute views of the world. The first one, very conventional. The second one, of a very ideological religious type. So then he discovers the middle way. And according to the stories, that comes from his experience of recalling an episode from his childhood where he went into a meditative state sitting under a rose apple tree. But the key point is he realizes that in order to make progress, he needs to come to terms with his body, to recognize not just that he needs his body, but that actually becoming integrated with his body, accepting his body fully as the condition of his life is the way forward. You know, will provide him with more understanding. So that, in my view, is the crucial point in the life of the Buddha. The recognition of the middle way, because that's a symbolic way of thinking about or representing how we can make a balanced judgment. We may have to go through that process of trying one extreme than the other, but hopefully we can gradually abbreviate that process or drop it all together before we focus in on the more balanced position where we can listen to the connection with our bodies and learn from the whole world around us, the experiences we have of it, rather than these fixed absolute views that we may otherwise adopt as a kind of shortcut. So that's just a bit then about the Buddha in the middle way, which I discuss in more detail in my book, The Buddha's Middle Way, which was the first book I published with Equinox, which was last year actually, yes. So now I'm just going to show you another slide, which is just, it's quite a complex slide. I'm not going to go into all the detail in it, but the point of it is just to show the number of different influences in the middle way and the ways in which the middle way can be understood in relation to lots of different sources. So not just Buddhism and not just Jung, though I think both of those are important, but also from lots of other perspectives, which means that there are lots of possible ways into it. So you can understand it in relation to systems theory. You can access it in relation to the arts, particularly with the value of imagination and creativity. You can understand it in relation to psychology, particularly quest to avoid biases and to develop, and the idea of integration, which I'll talk about more in a minute. You can understand the middle way in relation to scientific method, but particularly the provisionality which you need to work effectively in scientific judgment, and the way in which science tries to avoid confirmation bias, so avoid believing that the set of beliefs you have right now are the whole story, in other words, which I think is central to the middle way. You can also approach it from democratic politics, so the role of individual judgment is crucial, from critical thinking and education, development of the individual. You can learn a lot from neuroscience, particularly the division between left and right of the brain. I've mentioned embodiment in relation to the Buddha's discovery of the middle way. So there's a whole increasing movement of embodiment, embodied meaning, embodied practice, which is another possible approach to this. There's all sorts of stimuli in philosophy, going back to thousands of year old skeptical arguments, which basically show the uncertainty of our human situation. The ways in which our judgments about everything, including ethics and science and so on, are all situated. They depend on our particular position. And then also there are aspects of religious traditions that we can draw on, I think. So the mystical traditions in various religions can all help us to engage more with the experiential rather than the dogmatic. And then, of course, there's Buddhism. So yeah, that's a very brief taste, I think, just to try and show you something about the kind of synthesis that can go into one's view of the Middle Way. Okay, but now I ought to get on more to talk about the Red Book and Jung in order to focus more on this book specifically. So the Red Book, for those of you who are not familiar with it, the Red Book is an extraordinary document which comes from a series, or is inspired by a series of, you could call them induced visions, which Jung experienced particularly between the period of September 1913 to April 1914. So he induced these visions through a process of what he called active imagination. And active imagination basically involves, I think, entering a quite relaxed and focused state, which you can do, at least I find it, you can do through meditation. But you then allow things to arise. You allow your imagination to work, and you may find things come up, including figures come up in your imagination. So Jung made notes on the visions he had, and also notes on his reflections on those visions and how they felt they were significant to him. So his notes and reflections were made initially in what are called the Black Books, which have only just been published. They're basically his notebooks, initial notebooks on this material. As I say, there's actually a book launch for those by coincidence today. But obviously I haven't had a chance to look at the Black Books, which are it's a multi-volume expensive set. So it's a big study to get into the Black Books. Anyway, so he used those Black Books to then develop and write up the Red Book. So he wrote up the Red Book in a kind of calligraphic Gothic script and on medieval manuscript kind of style. So here is a sample page from the Red Book. As you'll see, it contains pictures, although the majority of the pages don't have pictures, but this one does. Often of a very intriguing symbolic way, but you'll also see the Gothic script and the way in which he wrote out the Red Book calligraphically. So he was writing this for his own satisfaction, it seemed, or perhaps for a small number of friends, not for an audience specifically. So he resisted publishing it during his life, and indeed his heirs continued to resist publishing it until 2009, when it was finally, an agreement was finally reached to publish it. So it's only since then, so the last 11 years, that we've been able to read it. So it's now available in two forms. There's the big full version, which has the facsimile of all the pages that Jung produced, which costs about £100, so it's quite an investment. There's also the reader's edition, which just gives you the translated text. So you can read in English, English translation, because he read in German, of course, what Jung wrote, but you can't get the pictures, unfortunately, from the reader's edition. Okay, so that's brief intro to what the Red Book is. So I'm going to stop sharing for a short time there and talk a bit about the reasons why the Red Book is interesting, really. and what drew me to writing more about it. So, so the Red Book records a kind of a personal integration process. So in the Red Book, Jung encounters a series of archetypal figures. And these figures, they're kind of, they seem autonomous from him in the sense that, you know, we might call them unconscious or representing the unconscious, but obviously they were conscious at the time he encountered them. So what's more significant about them, I think, is that they represent voices that he might not be aware of in his ordinary life, you know, that he might not readily identify with, but though are nevertheless there within his psyche, you know, so within his wider experience. So those kinds of voices, I think, we all have within ourselves, but we might only become aware of them over a period of time through the application of awareness over that period of time. So it's exactly through doing things like what Jung did, listening to those voices, that we can become more aware of our multiplicity, you know, that we're not just this ego now who thinks I'm me and I've got this perspective. We can have many other perspectives. So engaging with these voices helped Jung to develop greater continuity of awareness of his own variations, if you like. So that's what we could call an integration process, or Jung tended to use the term individuation. So becoming more whole as a person, integrating those different parts of oneself. So following this process in Jung's Red Book, Jung's account of it can act as a huge potential source of inspiration for us, I think, in following a similar process. Obviously, the inner figures that we might encounter will probably be different ones, but there will be some basic similarities, and there might be similarities in the way in which we might work with them. Now, there's a close relationship between integration and the integration process and the middle way, which is where the middle way connects with Jung. So Jung has to find the middle way in his treatment of these figures. And perhaps the most obvious way he has to do this to start with is recognizing that they're neither real, in inverted commas, nor unreal, in inverted commas. So it's easy to get hung up on this idea, or at least it seems initially people find it easy to get hung up on this idea. And so when he was inexperienced perhaps with handling these figures, he started worrying about this. So do they really exist, as it were? Obviously, if we treat them entirely like an external person, that can be problematic because they're not aspects of us. But if we also treat them as unreal, as though they weren't telling us anything of interest, you know, if we didn't recognize them as revealing aspects of our own experience, then that will be equally deluded. So we have to steer a middle way in relation to such figures, to remain open to what they're saying as aspects of us, but also as independent of us in other respects. And that also has parallels to how we might treat actual external people in our experience. Because in some ways, when you meet an external person, you know, like when I meet you, of course I'm meeting you as you experience you, but I'm also meeting you as I'm experiencing you. I'm experiencing my perspective on you at the same time. And I can't entirely free myself from that perspective, guiding my responses. So these different figures tell him often contradictory things that have to be balanced out with each other. So there's a lot of middle way also involved in responding appropriately to what the figures say. So it would be easy to assume, you know, if people have these visionary experiences, that they're giving revelations. You know, if you interpret the term revelations as meaning they tell you the truth, but it's obviously not like that in the Red Book. These figures are giving him different perspectives from the ones that were dominant in him before, but they may be just as mistaken as his other perspectives. It's the fact that there are other perspectives that's crucial. So you have to go through a careful process of sorting, really, as to how helpful is what they're saying. And Jung certainly, after a while, at least he learns not to just take what they say as the truth. So all the figures that Jung meets are archetypal, and by that term, I would understand that they fulfill long-term integrative functions for him. So they have different ways of making him aware of parts of himself that he needs to grow into, as it were. So the strongest of those is what in Jungians tend to call the self with a capital S, which can also be called the God archetype, and also associated with the wise old man archetype, or in some cases the wise old woman archetype. So there are a number of figures that Jung meets. So Izdubar, who I'll talk about in a minute, Elijah, based on the Old Testament prophet, Philemon. These are wise old man, or Izdubar is a kind of God figure. Elijah and Philemon are wise old man figures. So let me show you, in fact, some pictures of them. So I'll go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so there's a picture of Izdubar on the left. These are both Jung's pictures. They both come from the Red Book. So Izdubar is this kind of chthonic is the word that springs to mind, which means kind of the earth, but this huge sort of ancient threatening giant with an axe. He's also associated with bulls, it seems. But the main thing, I suppose, when Jung first encounters him is that he's huge and frightening. And then, obviously, it immediately turns out that Izdubar is also frightened of Jung. So there's a very interesting story there, which I'll come back to shortly. But so Izdubar is a kind of God figure. Philemon, who's illustrated in the other picture, is this wise old man figure who both alerts Jung to some very useful insights, and I think creates some very great difficulties for him. And again, I'll come back to that point because it's a very interesting one. So we have those archetypal figures. So that's one kind of archetypal figure, you could say, the self or the God archetype. But there are also shadow figures. So there are demons. There's this sort of urbane devil figure called the Red One, who Jung encounters. There's also a tramp. So Jung also encounters the shadow in the form of somebody who's sort of socially rejected. So yeah, there are different ways that Jung has to come to terms with what he finds threatening or evil. Then there's the anima figures. So the anima figures, obviously, for Jung are feminine figures, female forms generally. But Jung makes it clear, I think, in the Red Book that these figures are compensatory for who you are. So he also talked later about animus figures for women, which would compensate them. There would be more masculine figures, which would compensate for their femininity, which I think suggests a general principle that the anima stroke animus is an attractive other. Whatever your tendencies, it will be the attractive other beyond those tendencies. So for Jung, being obviously by that time already getting on into middle age, and a man obviously, and heterosexual, then the animal predominantly takes the form of a young woman. And he encounters Salome, who is this young woman who accompanies Elijah, who is associated with the Salome, who is the daughter of Herod, who demanded the head of John the Baptist, so is regarded by Jung as bloodthirsty and threatening in some ways. There's also the soul, so he talks about the soul as his, the rest of him. There's the unfulfilled feminine part of him that he's been looking for, which sometimes takes the form of a serpent or of a bird. There's also a hidden daughter in a castle. There's a maiden who is tortured by demons. There's an intuitive cook. So various feminine figures which seem to represent the animal. And then finally the fourth, I think, major type of archetype is the hero. So there's a Siegfried-like hero figure who Jung experiences himself as killing. So the killing of the hero becomes a motif he wrestles with. And also Christ becomes a kind of hero figure, as well as being associated with God. So that's a very quick list of some of the figures that Jung encounters, and they all have fascinating stories attached to them, so I can't do anything like justice to the stories in the Red Book, obviously, in this context. You just have to pick it up and read them, really. There is also a lot of reflection on death in the Red Book. And Jung had a thing about death. I mean, he had a connection with spiritualism and the dead going back to his youth. He had a cousin who was a medium. So obviously had a thing about the dead in a sort of literal sense throughout his life. But the dead also in the Red Book also seem to represent not the literal dead, but people who are stuck, basically. So people who are perhaps heavily left hemisphere dominant, or people who can't get out of a particular dominant type of belief. So he encounters the dead as these obsessed pilgrims who keep bothering him, as well as other forms of dead people as well. And then there's also a lot of exploration of language in the Red Book. So there's a hermit who lives in the desert called Ammonius. And Jung has long debates with him about language. Well, it's about meaning, really, the meaning behind language, and whether it's multiple or single, really, and the dilemmas between that. There's also a scholar in the castle, so this dry as dust scholar, who kind of typifies the worst aspects of being a scholar, really. So being obsessive and having fixed ideas, and so kind of wrapped up in his abstractions that he's actually distractible. And this in this same castle where the scholar lives, there's also this hidden daughter who he encounters subsequently, so which is obviously the repressed aspect of the scholar. So Jung is finding both the scholar and the daughter in himself, which tells you something, I think, about the ways in which we can get stuck on the belief that our language represents the world. Yeah, so scholarship is very much engaged in trying to come up with complete explanations of the world in language. But the daughter kind of represents the life behind that, you know, the embodied nature of meaning. Okay, so that's obviously a quick tour of some of the themes in the Red Book. But finally, so I hope I've brought out some of the ways in which this is about the middle way already so far, particularly that the way Jung engages with these figures involves a constant navigation, yeah, between extreme assumptions in relation to these figures. But Jung also talks about the middle way in an explicit sense. So although most of my book is about what you might call the implicit middle way in the Red Book, there's also some of the Red Book which is explicitly about the middle way, and that explicit element, again, just doesn't seem to have been discussed by any scholars who've discussed the Red Book so far. It's just been ignored. So here is an example of a reference to the Middle Way, of which there are a number in the Red Book. So the God, remember he's talking about the God archetype here, the God called me towards the right and the left, his voice calling out to me from both sides. Yet the God wants neither the one nor the other. He wants the middle way, but the middle is the beginning of the long road. So the left and the right here is a big theme of the Red Book as well. You can see that, well, in some cases very much as a reversal of the left and right hemispheres. So what we experience as right is more associated with the left hemisphere. What we experience as left is connected with the right hemisphere. So I think Jung, living before a lot of that neuroscience was generally known, he associates them the other way around. So at one point he has a choice to make between the left corridor and the right corridor. It's very obvious that, you know, if he goes from the left corridor, he meets this intuitive cook, and if he goes from the right side way of the corridor, he meets this very fusty, particular librarian who is a bit of a sort of positivist, absolutist, you know, who has no time at all for the intuitions of the cook. So there's this dichotomy, obviously, between what he calls the right and the left, which connects very much with discussions about the middle way. And if any of you have come across the work of Ian McGilchrist and The Master and His Emissary, that's been a big influence on me in the development of middle way philosophy, and I think can help in many ways to make sense of the Red Book as well. So the the explicit references to the middle way. Actually, I've got another one here. Yes, so this is one of the other good ones. The high blazing flame is the middle way, whose luminous course runs between the human and the divine. So again, we can think there, I think, of the divine as this kind of ideal of perfection we might set ourselves when we conceptualize it by comparison with the imperfections of the human. And obviously we could go to the extreme of identifying ourselves too strongly with the divine, forgetting where we're coming from, forgetting the conditions we have to work with, or identifying ourselves too strongly with the human and losing our sense of inspiration about where we're going. But the middle way seems to be communicating here has its own luminosity, its own fire. So it can inspire us in its own way. So that's possibly one of the crucial things I want to try and get across in the book I've written. So let me talk then more about my book and the structure of my book. So here's a list of the chapter headings. So as you see, I work my way through, well, first of all, the discussion of the middle way in general and the parallels between the Red Book and Buddha's quest, but also then different kinds of archetypal figures or their symbols that represent them. So the God archetype, a number of different aspects of the God archetype, then the shadow, the anima and the hero, and then I look at those themes of embodied meaning, the dead, and finally at ethics in relation to the Red Book. So to say a bit more about those before I finish, I'll try not to go on too much longer, but so yeah, perhaps the most crucial chapter here is the first one after the introduction. So the middle way in the Red Book and the Buddha's quest. So perhaps rather than trying to talk about all the chapters, I'll just say more about that first crucial chapter. So what are the parallels between the Buddha's middle way and Jung's experience of the middle way? Some of the ones I bring out in that chapter are that both of them are universal in aspiration. So I talk about that as universality, but it's possible to misunderstand that idea. There's a kind of top-down universality and a bottom-up universality. So if you're a top-down universalist, you think you've got the total explanation of everything, and you just apply those concepts to everything you encounter. But I think the middle way is much more about a bottom-up universal approach. It's a practical theory, if you like. So it's an account of how we should work best in our mixed up, imperfect, embodied situation. A situation in which we've got to make risky judgments all the time, constantly, where there are no certainties. But nevertheless, it really does help whenever we make generalizations to try and make them as adequate as possible. So a practical approach that can help us understand our own experience, like Jung's or the Buddha's, can probably apply to other people's as well. And the more we can understand the general conditions that affect human beings and how they work, the better we'll be able to understand our own experience. So it's that kind of universality that I think we can find in the middle way of the Buddha and also of Jung in the Red Book. So yeah, I mean, one of the things you can say about the archetypes that the archetypal forms that Jung encounters in the Red Book is that they show how the symbols we encounter of different aspects of ourselves can vary, but the functions remain similar. So I've already mentioned, how Jung encountered different figures representing the shadow, or different figures representing the anima, or different figures representing the God archetype. So the functions are not the same as the symbols, and I think that's a common confusion people fall into when they think about archetypes, that they confuse them with specific symbols, but they're not. They're very schematic. They're ways of operating, if you like. They're ways we can be inspired in particular ways. So as I've mentioned, things like the shadow is things that are threatening to us. The anima are things that are other but attractive. The hero is particularly associated with our efforts, our goals. So these are very, very general descriptions or functions, if you like, in our lives, not of specific symbols. So these are found in both Jung and the Buddha. In the Buddha, I've mentioned the story of the palace and the forest. So that's the kind of contrast that we can find in relation to any kind of archetypal symbol. You can take it as just being conventional. You can take it as being an absolute. So you, for example, you could kind of understand the Buddha's quest in some ways as a quest for the God archetype. So did he assume God wasn't relevant, that he should just go along with the human things going on in the palace? Or was God to be found in the forest, in the commands of his teachers, in the absolute beliefs of the ascetics, in those religious absolutes? And the Buddha concluded, no, neither. So they found in his experience. So he avoids projecting that archetype of God on either of those contexts. The God doesn't exist in the forest, nor does it exist in the palace, as it were. Existence isn't what it's about. It's about finding the God inspiration in his own experience. So in the same way, Jung needs to treat the inspirational meaning he's finding in these figures he meets in this middle way fashion, neither treating it as real nor unreal, neither treating it as metaphysical truths of some kind, nor dismissing it. Okay, so that kind of universality, I think, it's a subtle, challenging form of universality, but it's much more adequate to the difficulties of our lives, than many beliefs, absolutist beliefs are. Jung and the Buddha also engaged in a process. So at each stage, they have to apply the middle way as best they can to moving forward from where they are. Which means that it's not something you could work out from a final goal, although the Buddha obviously has this idea of enlightenment as something he's navigating towards. In his early life, he hasn't got there yet. He can't just kind of deduce from what enlightenment is what he ought to do. He's got to experiment. He's got to work out where he's going. So it's a process. And Jung, I think, really gets to grips with that even more than Buddhism generally has, because he's quite explicit that it's not about a final goal. It's about a process where we make better judgments. And yeah, he in the Red Book, he rejects that possibility of a final goal. In fact, he identifies it. He sort of envisages, well, what would it be like to really get there, as it were? And he sees that as stasis, as a rather boring state of things if you actually were together. But actually, we can't really imagine it because we're processual beings, if you like. Both the Buddha and Jung also are involved in avoiding absolutely opposed beliefs of different kinds. So those are the extremes to be avoided in the middle way. So this is one of the features of absolute beliefs, that they tend to form opposed pairs. Whether you're talking in a very abstract way, whether you're talking philosophically, about, say, theism versus atheism, free will versus determinism, realism versus idealism, these are all abstractions, absolutes that philosophers talk about and oppose to each other. But we can also find these in our everyday experience. So we get these two vice-like assumptions that can close in on us and rule out our alternatives when we're making a practical decision. If somebody, for example, is causing difficulties for you, do you react to them in a negative way? Do you give way to them? So those are two obvious absolute alternatives, but there may be alternatives and third alternatives between those two, which involve reframing, thinking again about how to respond. The Buddha and Jung also, I think, adopt what's basically a skeptical perspective, where uncertainty is recognized and beliefs are provisional. I know that's a controversial thing to say, actually, in both contexts. So there will be Buddhists who argue that the Buddha is not skeptical, and also Jungians who argue that Jung isn't skeptical. And I think there are issues in both cases there with how they've been interpreted, but also in Jung's case, a lot of inconsistency in how he represents himself. So I would say 95% of the Red Book is skeptical, and then there's this section called the 7 Sermons, which really isn't, which is deeply problematic. So I have a chapter on that later in my book, which tries to get to grips with the metaphysical absolutes which are preached in the 7 Sermons by Philemon. So that's why he's a problematic figure as well, I think. But yeah, so what I'm bringing out really in the Red Book is something I find in most of it, which I think has been neglected on the whole by Jungians, but which provides a quite rather different view of what Jung's insights are from the one that we're often presented with. So it's a view that comes out of his early work as reflected in the Red Book, predominantly rather than what he says in his later writings. The middle way is also an individual middle way, and there's a rather striking quotation about this in. Let me show you oh yes, sorry, I missed these parts. Yes, so the this is another quotation from the Red Book. So there is only one way, and that is your way. You seek the path, I warn you away from my own. It can also be the wrong way for you. May each go his own way. Okay, so here Jung is confronting the total particularity of his own path. Yeah, so in a way it's obvious that given that each of us has slightly different conditions to deal with, that we're going to make different decisions are going to be right for us in those conditions. So if we take somebody else's account of what the way is, then we may well make mistakes because we won't be taking into account those differences between our particular situations. So Jung is warning us away from that, and it's an aspect of the middle way, I think, that it is particular, but without being relativist. So I don't take the implications of this to be relativist, because it doesn't mean that all ways are of equal value, or all judgments are of equal value, which is the practical implication that most people take from relativism. So there can still be better and worse judgments, and I talk a lot about this in the final chapter of the book on ethics. So there can be better and worse ways, if you like, but it's still nevertheless your particular way. It's an individual way. And again, I think that applies also to the Buddha. You know, in the Buddha's situation, he has to find his own way. He has to find his own way of practicing in the different situations he finds himself. Okay, and a final point about this. This all comes from my first chapter on the middle way. About well, two interesting figures the Buddha meets. So he meets a hermit called Ammonius, who I've mentioned in the desert. He also meets this urbane devil, which he calls the Red One. So there are episodes where he meets both of those, and then a bit later on he meets them together. So the hermit, who's obviously very deeply Christian in his commitments, and the devil, who was anti-Christian, have formed an unholy alliance. So they've been converted, as it were, to each other's perspectives in a rather superficial way. So the theme of the unholy alliance is one that you also find explored interestingly in the Red Book. And I think this is a theme which one's likely to bump up against if one explores the middle way. So the odd feature that you get, that whenever you try and find a new way forward that questions the extreme absolute assumptions, opposing assumptions that two opposing groups may adopt, they may actually put more value on maintaining that framing and maintaining that conflict than they do on the alternative that you may be offering them. So that's when the unholy alliance comes into play. You know, so that the two apparently opposed groups will unite against you, saying, no, we don't want to look at this differently. We're quite happy with how we are, thanks. This is very much Jung's experience when he meets Ammonius and the Red One. Okay, so I think I'm going to wind up there, because obviously I could go on and talk about all my other chapters. What I might just do actually is flip through my slides to show you a few other things very briefly. So yeah, this is an encounter with Izdubar, who I mentioned before. So the bull god, this huge frightening god figure whom Jung meets in a vision. And the very interesting thing here is that to start with, Izdubar is frightened of him because Jung to Izdubar represents Western science, and particularly no longer believing in the God archetype. And his encounter with Izdubar then becomes a way of understanding and engaging with the God archetype without believing in it. So it's very, very relevant to the whole sort of modern dilemma with God, the issues that people have with adopting all this traditional supernatural paraphernalia, belief paraphernalia, but nevertheless the need that we have for God to be meaningful, archetypally meaningful. Okay, so I don't have time to go into that more, but yeah, actually, if you look on YouTube, there is a previous talk I've given, which was at the Festival of the Middleweight in April, about Jung's Red Book, where I talk in a lot more detail about the Izdubar episode. So if you are interested in hearing me talk more about this, then you can do so there. So then just a few pictures. So these are pictures which are reproduced in my book, as well as from the Red Book. So this is a picture which relates to the theme of the Tree of Life, which is a great symbol of the middle way, as Jung uses it in the book. It also relates to the Kabbalah, but Tree of Life, the idea is that you continue to grow. There's a value in growing, as it were, a value in developing and stretching your potentials. But the tree doesn't have any other specific values which it can take for granted. You know, it has to work out in each case where to grow into. So the Tree of Life can be quite a powerful image of the process of growing in the middle way. And Jung complicates this in this image by having a double-rooted bi-directional tree. So it's rooted at both ends and grows into the middle. So you could see that as a sort of middle way tree, you know, but growing into the middle from the extremes, as it were. Then there's Jung's mandalas. So I write a lot about those. This is one of the earlier mandalas, which Jung got from looking at the images created by a guy called Haeckel, who examined natural forms, as it were, so sea cases and sea creatures and things under a microscope. And he turned these initially into mandalas. So they seem to be the initial inspiration for his mandalas. But the mandala is a kind of diagram of integration. I think it evolved into one anyway. So it's represents the ways in which the outer elements may be united into gradually united into a more unified perspective. And this is another of Jung's more developed later mandalas, which contains our archetypal figures as well. So we've got archetypal figures on the outside, and I think the key idea is the way in which those archetypal figures are integrated into the mandala as a whole, and the center, obviously the star there, is the point of integration. So there are a number of different different mandalas discussed in my chapter on the Tree of Life and the mandala. Okay, but I think I really will stop there. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing, and open to questions. I said, so I've just got a note from Christina. Yes, it had to be. Okay, that's fine. So anybody else? If you'd like to ask a question, I mean, you can just jump in. I think that's Robin. You're muted, Robin. I still can't hear you, even though you're unmuted.
You hear me now?
Yes.
So the quote from Jung regarding the individual path, it kind of answers the question, I think, but to what extent would you encourage a personal exploration of the sort that Jung engaged in through examining dreams? And second part would be, have you done so yourself?
Can I just get clear on the first bit? So to what extent have I included my own, or to what extent did Jung include his own experience?
Yeah, that quote from Jung regarding, you know, we each find our own path, it's sort of partly answered my question, but I wondered whether you have
I tried that path myself?
Yeah, and whether you would encourage others to do.
I'd certainly encourage others to do, yes. Obviously, well, I've attempted it in particularly, I suppose, the first part of Red Book Middleway was written on a retreat back in 2016, where I was, you know, trying to engage in that process actively as I was reflecting on the Red Book and beginning to put together the book as a response. So yes, the active imagination process, I think, is just trying that is something I have found very fruitful. The way I do that, which comes from my background, obviously, of having practiced meditation for a long time, is just to get into a relaxed, focused state through mindfulness practice, and then just leave it open and see whatever comes up. And I then found, certainly a lot of the time, some kind of figure would appear. And then sometimes I could ask that figure questions or have some communication with him or her or it. Sometimes that didn't work at all. Yeah, so there's the difficult middle way involved actually in sort of steering that process, not forcing it, not sort of taking it over with the ego, but not being too passive either. It's a bit like, you know, you do have to do that in meditation as well. Yeah, so I did find that very fruitful in terms of some of the figures I encountered and the kind of things they told me. But I have to say it's nowhere near as developed or as profound as Jung as they're recorded in the Red Book. But I did find it fruitful to try and engage in that process, yes. But is that answering your question, Robin?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So I would recommend trying it, certainly. Yeah. Anyone else? Dylan.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk, and I very much look forward to reading your book. I had basically one comment and one question. The comment was that I think the way you presented the middle way, also with the pictures of the Buddha's life, him leaving his family and then leaving the forest, very nicely showed that the middle way is relational and dynamic rather than an absolute point. I mean, there can be one cannot find the middle way without, to some extent, balancing it out on the two extremes of whatever problem one is facing. And then the question I had was, to what extent would you say was Jung's approach influenced by Henri Corbin, the expert on Sufism? I think they were quite closely associated, but would you say that his approach was strongly influenced by working with Henri Corbin and his work on the active imagination in the Sufi context, or was it something quite separate from that?
I can't really answer that in detail, I'm afraid. I mean, I've heard the name and that it was an influence on Jung, but that's all I can really say, really. I'm not in a position to assess that in terms of having studied that relationship in great detail or anything.
Right. Thank you.
Probably if you're up on Corbin, maybe you could say, do you have an opinion on it, or?
No, I don't. I wanted to ask your view on the matter. Thank you.
Any other questions? Justin.
Thank you very much, Robert. The talk was fascinating. I just wondered whether you could say a few words about the chapter you've got in the middle of the book on integrating the shadow, especially. I'm quite familiar with Jung's work on this, but I'd be interested to know what from the Buddha's life and teaching is especially connected with ideas around the shadow.
Okay, yeah. Well, obviously the big message in Jung is about the shadow is the interdependence of good and evil, as we tend to see them. Yeah, so we like to focus on the good as we see it, and tend to neglect the interdependence between that and what we've rejected. So I think some of the Red Book brings that out, but there are also some other points which I've been trying to bring out from the Red Book in what I wrote. So he talks about well, in this vision, sort of hell vision he has of demons attacking a maiden. You know, he draws the conclusion that the devil cannot sacrifice, and this is, I think, it's the idea that from an evil perspective, if you were to adopt and by this I would understand a very narrowed perspective, an absolutized perspective. Yeah. So from the perspective of somebody who's adopted that very narrow absolute way of thinking about things, you don't understand more integrated motives and more integrated perspectives. So that means you wouldn't understand well, the way in which a bigger perspective might make a sacrifice seem valuable. Yeah, so there's a discussion of that, and also there's this, I mentioned the urbane devil that Jung encounters called the Red One, and his conversation with the Red One is full of sort of rhetorical ploys and biases and fallacies, really. So there's a bit of analysis in my chapter of how the Red One employs these things as sort of deceptive devices for a narrowed purpose. Yeah. Now, as to how this relates to Buddhism, well, I think the shadow in Buddhism is represented primarily by Mara and the figure of Mara. So at first you might assume that there's quite a big difference between Mara and the kind of evil figures that Jung encounters. But I think the basic idea of a narrowed perspective is what they have in common. Yeah? So when the Buddha encounters Mara, it's kind of distracting him with some sort of narrowed perspective. So it could be craving or hatred, some other sort of narrowed state, in contrast to the bigger one that he's in, or that he's trying to get in or stay in. So when he's depicted as in the stories as trying to gain enlightenment, and Mara is trying to distract him, first of all, the Mara tries to tempt him with his erotic daughters, and then he attacks him with his warriors. But in both cases, these make no impression on the Buddha. So the Buddha, as I would read that, maintains his bigger perspective, in which he would just absorb these narrow perspectives. So I think you can relate that, perhaps not incredibly closely, but there is a relationship between that and what Jung says in the Red Book about really the narrowness of motive of the shadow figures he encounters, whether that's the sort of city devil, the red one, or the old-fashioned hellish devils that are sticking things into people in the pits, as it were, who he also encounters. Yeah, either way, that's part of the way in which I would understand evil and its role in general. That I think we should take evil seriously, but obviously see it as something we can, an aspect of our judgment, if you like. It's something we can get into through our judgments being too narrow. So it's not a property of people or even of particular perspectives or groups or anything. It's an aspect of us, as Jung would point out. But there is also this value in integrating the shadow, which allows us to distinguish what's really a threat from what isn't. So obviously we've got these deep-seated responses to threats, which are pretty useful to us. So we get out of the way if there's a lorry about to run us over, or we're about to be attacked by a dangerous animal or something. And those really are threats. But at the same time, we can overreact to somebody who reminds us of a threat in some way, who we project the shadow onto unnecessarily. So we need to be able to discriminate more between what's genuinely a threat and what's a projected absolute shadow, as we're seeing it. So the figures in the Red Book, I'd say, are about these sort of projected ideas of the shadow that we have to deal with and try and integrate. I hope that will make sense, because it's quite a complex picture. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Lorna.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. That was a great introduction to your book, which I hope will arrive tomorrow morning from Val's place. Thank you. My question is, I'm curious about the role of archetypes in a secular time, and acknowledging that Jung seemed quite Christian, or even also Old Testament, as I think Elijah was, and being curious about, are you suggesting, Robert, that archetypes is a practice? And in our Welsh group the other week, I think you talked about the potential of an archetype as a tree, which really resonated for me because I love trees, and I'm sure all of us love trees. But yeah, and do archetypes change? Because it sounds that Jung's were a sort of limited amount that he was in relation with. Yeah, I think that's my questions.
Okay, so can I just get to the main, going back to the beginning, what was the main question to start with?
It was, are archetypes a practice, and archetypes in secular time as opposed to Jung's Christian context? Okay.
Well, I think it's important here to distinguish between archetypes and symbols, which is something I mentioned earlier, yeah? So as I would see it, and as I think fits Jung's approach, and at least when I find him clearest, that archetypes are not the same as particular symbols or motifs. So they're functions which are shared by humans generally. And they're schematic in nature, so I could say a lot more about that. But that would mean that, for example, whether you're Christian or secular or Buddhist or whatever, then there will be similarities in the functions you have with other people, even from quite different traditions, and even different genders and so on. So those functions will be the same. So for example, whatever your attractive other is like, whichever gender they are, for example, there's still going to be an attractive other, so that will function in a similar way. So that's also where I'd see the religious secular distinction coming in. So I think archetypes appear for us whether we're in a religious or a secular context. It's just they're obviously likely to take a different form. I mean, there's quite a lot about this in my next book after this, which is called Archetypes in Religion Beyond, where I go into secular archetypes, for example, more. So things like nature and rationality and good and beauty and democracy, and so all sorts of concepts we use archetypally, I think, in the secular context. We tend to generally deal with them as concepts, although sometimes they're turned into visual symbols as well. So you get like statues of truth and paintings of beauty and so on. So they remain ideals, inspiring ideals for us. And they can work for us as long as we realize our responsibility for them, rather than them just being projections. So rather than God out there who'll sort it all out for you, you could have the same thing with democracy out there that will sort everything out for you, or reason or nature or whatever, who can do the same thing. So I think there's the same basic issues with working with archetypes, whatever form they take. And certainly you don't escape archetypal issues by leaving religion. So that's one of Jung's great quotes. It's directed at Christians, but you can leave Christianity, but Christianity doesn't leave you. So you'll still have those archetypes pursuing you. I would add, even if they take a different form, even if they're not Christian anymore, you're encountering some other form. Yeah, they're just human, as I would see it. Now, is that answering your question, which has had another part, didn't it?
Whether they change and whether they're a practice, or whether they're a practice. So if you could maybe, if you can, say something about your practice of working with archetypes and whether they change or whether they're constant.
Well, again, the symbols change, I think.
Okay.
But the archetypes themselves, well, there'll be a certain similarity in the ways that they reflect our needs and our need for inspiration over time, I think, and our need to stretch ourselves. So how have I personally practiced with archetypes? Well, I guess a lot of that has come through my attempts to engage with different religious traditions. So personally, I've been through engagement with both Christianity and Buddhism at different times, sometimes at the same time, and trying to find archetypal forms that were meaningful to me, that inspired me in those different traditions. So I think, I mean, I did go through a period of about 20 years sort of trying to engage with Buddhism and being for a while an ordained Buddhist, and but eventually concluding really that Buddhist symbols didn't really speak to me with the kind of depth that they needed to. So that's one of the main reasons why I returned very much to Christian ones, particularly in relation to imaginative life, as it were. Yeah, well, I suppose my chief practice in relation to archetypes at the moment is to do with art. So I recently went on a trip to Italy, where I was engaging with archetypal figures as I found them in Renaissance art. So they that kind of Christian depiction of archetypes in Renaissance art, whether it's obviously you get God, you get the animal in the form of Mary, you get Jesus, you get a number of other sort of hero figures, and you get the shadow, you get Satan and so on. Yeah, but it's hard to kind of distill it just to those figures. In a way, art can offer you a wider range of archetypal connections as well, I think. But that's I suppose for me personally, that's how I connect most with it. So I haven't really returned to a form of religious practice in a group. That's still a possibility for the future, but being deeply agnostic, that raises certain practical issues for me, as to how to engage with a group effectively. But if that turns out to be the way to engage with the archetypes most effectively, and the group will accept me, then maybe I'll do that in the future. I'll have to see.
Thank you.
And Laura.
There I am. When you showed the quote of Jung that Robin talked about, where he talks about finding your own path, it resonated for me with some of the Buddhist suttas, where Buddha talks about direct experience, not to go with a tradition or a teacher or whatever, that to rely in a way on your own sense of what is beneficial or not. Do you see that in Buddhist, in some of the Buddhist instructions, I guess, as well, as in Jung?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, perhaps you're thinking of the Kalama Sutta, are you?
Exactly. Yeah.
So where the Buddha says, don't just rely on these puzzled villagers don't know who to believe of all these different gurus sort of competing, and he says, don't just believe them on authority or because of their social position, for example, or because they've got this wonderful theory or whatever, but when you yourself know. So that to me suggests very much use experience as a basis of judgment. Not that none of those other considerations would be relevant, but they shouldn't be absolutized. So they shouldn't be taken to be the whole story. You can use them to inform your perspective. And then there's a similar thing where the Buddha, shortly before his death, is said to have told his followers to be lamps unto yourselves. And again, that suggests to me that kind of responsibility for our own judgment, which needs to be embodied, really, I think, for us to take full responsibility for it.
And a kind of autonomy in that responsibility that I thought I could hear in Jung's quote as well.
Yeah,
I like that.
Indeed. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of parallel there, I think, as well. Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? Robin? Hi, yeah.
I wondered if you could expand on the criticism of Jung in the Red Book. I think you alluded to sort of 5% maybe of the book, and I wondered if you could expand on that a little.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, it's a section which is known as the Seven Sermons, or Seven Sermons to the Dead, which occurs quite near the end of the Red Book. in the seven sermons, well, it comes out of the context of Jung being kind of plagued almost by these dead people who are making demands on him almost, and these very restless, sort of craving figures who are they're supposed to be pilgrims who went to Jerusalem, so they're supposed to be sort of absolutist Christians who went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem but didn't find what they were looking for in Jerusalem, so they came back looking for something else. So Jung seems to have had experiences of this. There's also a story, I think it's in Memories, Dreams and Reflections actually, where about these dead people appearing outside his house and him opening the door and seeing them there. So it obviously, there are various experiences there which have impacted Jung, but according to his account of it, he engaged with Philemon, the kind of guru, internal guru figure, if you like, the wise old man figure who he'd had this developing relationship with, which we find in the Red Book. Philemon spoke these seven sermons to the dead, and according to Jung, they satisfied the dead, so eventually they dispersed and stopped bothering him. So yeah, it's difficult to know what to make of some of that, but what I do find is that I find the sermons themselves very jarring in the context of the rest of the Red Book, because completely unlike the rest of the Red Book, they're kind of metaphysical instructions. So Philemon stands there and tells them, these are cosmic truths. This is, there is Abraxas, who is, it's a sort of Gnostic sermon. So this Gnostic totality God, Abraxas, is the source of everything, which unifies everything. And then there's a lot of other metaphysical claims which follow that. And Jung then, after each of the seven sermons, questions Philemon about them. But what I also found disturbing was the complete inadequacy of the answers that Philemon then gives. So Jung seems to be satisfied with those answers. But if you probe them at all, then they're just useless answers, really. Empty answers, the kind that gurus might classically give to fob off their disciples, perhaps. But they're not practically substantial answers. They're not helping anybody. So it puzzled me for a long time. Where is this coming from? And why did Jung write this? And I concluded, well, it has to be, I suppose, that he couldn't resist finding some sort of total metaphysical explanation or context in which to fit what he'd discovered, the insights that he'd found in the rest of the Red Book. And he'd read about Gnosticism, so all of this is taken from Gnosticism as a system. So it's a kind of now really dead offshoot of Christianity, partly independent, partly sometimes treated as a Christian sect or a heterodox Christian sect. As a result, this has been influential, and there were Jungians who've adopted this kind of Gnostic standpoint, but what comes with it is a whole sort of metaphysical stance, and I can't see the advantages of that stance really of adopting it, because it's it's supposed to be an alternative to the Christianity which didn't satisfy these dead people, but really they've just swapped one metaphysics for another, which doesn't, in terms of the middle way, doesn't get you anywhere, except maybe as a transit point, but it doesn't certainly get you anywhere in a lasting way. And just the whole tone of the way the seven sermons are presented also just doesn't fit for me with the insights of the rest of the Red Book. So that's why I felt I needed to include a chapter on it. So the chapter in my book is called Gnostic versus agnostic. So I explain all, you know, in more detail, obviously some of the stuff I've just said there, that you know, how the what the weaknesses are really in that section of the book, but also yeah, that one needs to put that in the wider context of Jung's agnosticism, which I think is in the Red Book as a whole is much more important. So you can find this practically oriented perspective in the Red Book as a whole, even if the that section is inconsistent with it.
So does he come to any conclusion then, or is it that there isn't it doesn't come down on one side or another as such and make a conclusion of it?
Oh, he does, yes, in the sense that Philemon preaches this sermon to the dead, and the dead, after some initial resistance, accept it. And as I said earlier, they disperse, they're satisfied in the end, which I think represents a resolution for Jung. He feels that they've been integrated by this process. Yeah. But as I say, that just doesn't ring true for me. That process gives them grounds or gives them a way of being integrated. Yeah, obviously you'll need to draw your own conclusions. But yeah, I did feel I needed to make that case, because obviously it's going to stick out like a sore thumb if you read the Red Book and read the rest of my account of it or interpretation of it. Then the 7 sermons is just not going to fit. So one needs to make some sort of explanation of how one thinks it occurred like that. Loath as I was to spend too much time on it or to give too much emphasis to it.
Mm.
Okay, we're just about up to the time we said, sort of 9 o'clock UK time. So perhaps we can leave it there then. So yeah, just one final point actually. So somebody did mention I think it was Dylan mentioned the Middleweight Society. So if you are interested in exploring the Middleweight further and you're not already involved, then do have more of a look at our website, middleweightsociety.org, where you did your booking. So we do have regular network meetings where I give talks about the middle way, or it's usually me anyway. He talks about the middle way, and then we have discussions. And we're also developing other kinds of groups, like practice groups and reading groups and so on. So it's all in our, our aims as a society are to help develop understanding of the middle way, but also support the practice of the middle way. So we combine theory with practice in everything we do. So if you're interested, you'd be very welcome to join in with those activities. So just look on the website for more details. So the Middle Way Network is the key thing. Okay, so great to meet you, those of you I don't already know, and hope you enjoy the book. And if you have any other questions, and I'm very happy to discuss things with you by email or in any other contexts.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you, Robert.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Great.
Robert. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.